Learned as a therapist, and I continue to learn this over and over again, is the psychological factors that impacts negatively another human being, another individual who at face value looks like they can think and feel and behave like you. It's really hard for me to look at them and say, you're a criminal. Who says that, right? There's a lot of therapists out there who study the psychology of crime. Forensic psychologists, for example, they study the psychological factors that impacts things like, maybe a guilty plea by reason of insanity. They also try to explain, identify, and even research some of the behaviors that are motivated by psychological issues, right? Like murder or burglary or rape and assault. A forensic psychologist is going to get in the middle of that and try to figure out what's going on with the individual. Criminologists, however, or people who are psychologists and they study the different biological, neurological, and psychological factors of crime, these individuals want to understand why criminals do what they do. It's pretty scary to sit and think that I have to deal with this individual in my family, or this person that I've married, or this person that I love. I have to deal with the reality that they're not going to think like me. Neither are they going to behave in a way that's similar to me. They don't want the same thing. Once you finally identify that the person who is in your world is a criminal, you can then go to the next step, which is asking, do they want what I want? And even though they may tell me verbally that they want what I want in life, peace, making a good living, maybe having children or being in a long-term relationship, traveling, becoming successful. They may say, yes, I'm on the same page as you. I want what you want. But actions often speak louder than words for criminals. You really have to be sure that you're talking to the person and you're really and honestly connecting and understanding them, connecting with and understanding them. Because a lot of criminals know how to talk the talk, but walking the walk is a totally different thing. The fear conditioning of a criminal is way different than fear conditioning for other human beings. By that, I mean something that has happened to you most likely has caused you to associate something negative with a stimulus that is neutral. And because of that association, you now have a built-up fear and anxiety around it. Take, for example, dealing with a family member who's very toxic and unstable. You have dealt with them for many years in your family. Nobody can seem to manage them. They tend to be very judgmental, critical, emotionally driven most of the time. They're just a lot, in quotation marks. All of the emotional disagreements and arguing happened at the location that this family member used to stay or live. So now, because you associate that stimulus, that place, that home, apartment, whatever, with your aunt, you most likely will not want to go back to that location because it's reminding you of all the pain and the emotions and the thoughts that you had in that location. So what do? You avoid it. Or you may go there and start having anxiety, or feeling like you're having a panic attack, or feeling like you're shutting down, right? And so that's how we develop fear conditioning. And so if we look at criminals, we can very clearly say this, that their fear conditioning is extraordinarily poor. They either don't have it at all, and that's where a psychopath is born, or they do have it, but it's very minimal. And that's really where most criminals are. Let me also include the psychology of risk and protective factors in this. You may have a brother who has engaged in many criminal acts, and yet on the flip side of things, he's smart, he's kind when he wants to be, He's charming, you know. He always wanted to be a lawyer. He's actually studying law right now on probation. He wants to do the right thing, but something in him, that other side of him, causes him to not be what he's supposed to be, to not be what we want him to be, right? You, the family, whoever. It's because this individual appears to have two different sides of themselves. And sometimes that's the result of what we call risk factors. Risk factors are basically things that makes us vulnerable and can really impact us in a negative way. It's basically all the things that you see on this questionnaire right here, the ACEs questionnaire. When an individual has a lot of risk factors and very little to no protective factors, it is very likely that they are going to grow up and become unstable adults, have a lot of trauma to work through, have a lot of poor relationships, not really know themselves, right? So not have an identity. And so it's like being in this adult world where you don't even know where you're supposed to be. You don't know what's up, you don't know what's down, you don't know who to trust, you don't know if you want to trust. You also may not know if you can handle the daily responsibility of getting out of bed, being on a schedule, eating a good breakfast, going to the gym, keeping up with the job requirements and following direction from others, having a boss and a supervisor, working together as a team with coworkers. When all of those things feel like a huge trip to the gym, right? Like you're lifting the heaviest weights of all, you say, you know what? If you have the mind of a criminal, you may say, you know what? I don't want this. I don't want to do this. This is not what I want. What I'm going to do is steal from somebody and take everything that they have worked so hard for. Why? Because it's easier, and that's what I want to do. It's easier than me putting my mind to work. It's easier than me having to put up my energy, right? I'm just going to do what I want to do. That's going to make life easier on me. And that is where criminality is born sometimes. Other times, again, it's genes and biology. Research does suggest that there's an association between parents who are criminals and their children who are criminal. You may have an aunt who's really criminal. She has stolen, lied, cheated, she's been incarcerated, she's also been on probation many times, and she carries drugs around all the time, and she's being pulled over and has a bunch of tickets for traffic violations. And this kind of a parent not only talks around their children, but the children may have observed her criminal behavior, her lies, her deceit, her manipulation. And if that's the case, what happens? Research suggests that those behaviors then fall on the child at whatever age, as long as they're under the age of 18, and they're constantly under that parent. So their criminal behavior as parents often falls on them. And it is up to the child, the adolescent, to determine if they're going to allow that or if they're going to be different. And if you have an environment full of risk factors, it's a lot easier to just do what mom is doing, to just do what dad is doing. We also can't leave out mental health challenges. Substance abuse is in here as well. Economic stability. Coming from a family of intimidators and bullies. Controlling every ounce of life, you know, to make it, to get ahead, to be successful can be very tiring to these individuals, right? You have to have self-restraint. You have to have the ability to restrain yourself or constrain yourself. You also have to dedicate yourself to getting an education or getting a really good job. You have to be an honest, sincere person. And sometimes life backfires even when you're being honest and sincere. And these are all the things that most criminals don't want to have to deal with. They don't feel most of the time like they can measure up. And so they fall to the bottom of the barrel and they manipulate everybody in that barrel until they go back to prison, until they get back on probation. It's a really complicated loop, and it's something that continues to happen in a lot of families. If you feel like you have a family member like this, you want to keep watching. When I was working, I'm going to say over 10 years ago, in a juvenile delinquency center, a juvenile delinquency school, and I was also on a residential unit. I also had the opportunity to spend a year visiting jails and looking at the prison system and really getting to know criminology, if you will. I remember looking at some of the men, because I've always done any kind of like forensic psychology or any kind of, just observing the criminal behavior of individuals. I've always worked with boys. It's never been females. That's just kind of the way my career took me. So I was in these programs where young men were creating crimes. And I remember walking through the residential treatment facility, the unit, and I'm listening to conversation, and I'm hearing profanity, and I'm hearing low self-esteem, I'm hearing silliness of mind, a lot of joking, a lot of laughing in a very bad situation. Maybe this young man murdered somebody, maybe this young man raped and then he burglarized, maybe this young man opened fire on his stepfather. These are actually cases that I had at the time. They were facing a lot of jail time, years worth. I had a young man who was 18, and he not only burglarized a home, but he sexually violated or assaulted the woman of that home that he burglarized. He shot the father in the head, and he kidnapped the baby that was there. Why? Because his ex-girlfriend, that was her family. So I remember walking the unit one day, and I'm just looking around in complete and utter shock at what I'm listening to, as to what I'm seeing with my own eyes, the energy in the room, the feeling of being there. And I remember hearing my client way in the back somewhere, and he's giggling and he's laughing, and he's silly-minded because he's not mature, he's young, he doesn't know what life is all about. And I remember turning around and looking at him and saying, do you think it's funny that you sexually assaulted the mother of your ex-girlfriend, that you shot her father in the head, that you kidnapped the baby? Do you think that's okay? Is that funny? And I remember him pausing, and he started looking, and he says, no, Miss Tamara, it's not. I said, well, then stop laughing. You don't have the right to do that. And I said, as a matter of fact, you're going to come with me, because you need to listen to some things, and I think we need to explore some things in your own mind. And so we spent the next hour in therapy, and it was sad because he had done so well under me before I resigned from that position. When I resigned, I got word from a coworker that he ended up committing another crime, and he was placed on probation for 3 years. And his ability to grow and go to school and change was limited greatly. And I still question to this day, did he have affective empathy, or did he have cognitive empathy? Maybe in some ways he had a little bit of both. I don't know, but I did have hope for this young man. And again, he had done really well from 18, 19, 20, and then he hit 21, and I resigned from the facility. But I remember looking at his life story. He had a whole packet, a whole file. And I was scrolling through his file one day, and I saw a lot of risk factors. I saw a lot of trauma. And I remember looking at this file thinking, oh my God, this child was set up for disaster from the very beginning. If you have somebody in your life like this, you want to do what I did. You want to be able to look back and say, wait a minute, what has happened to this person? And here's what I was looking for in his file. What was it like when he came home from the hospital as an infant? Well, he was put in his crib, and this was reported to Child Protective Services by his grandmother. He was put in a crib and cried and cried and cried for many hours, many months, and at least for an entire year before he was removed from that drug-infested home where his mother had been prostituting and his father had been engaging in the selling of drugs within the home. Dad was also involved in trafficking, sex trafficking. And so this whole house was just a wreck, for lack of a better term. And this really shook my client. And so his infancy up until the age of 6.5 years old had been awful. And his 7th birthday is what really shook him, because not only was his sister brutally murdered at his birthday party, okay? This was a very traumatizing case of mine. The criminals who had killed his sister, who was 10 years old at the time, they had crashed the party. And they crashed the party in hopes of getting back at Dad for, you know, his sex trafficking and the drugs that his wife had been bringing in. And so this baby's birthday party was crashed. Mom was murdered. You know, it was a terrible crime scene. And he mentioned that his grandmother got him help through a therapist. And that therapist diagnosed him with ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. That was not properly treated. Why? Because grandma didn't see it as a big issue. But it had been causing a ton of problems with his school. His academic attendance was poor. He wasn't able to hold things in his mind for long periods of time. His executive functioning, was awful because of his age and because of his untreated ADHD. He was very impulsive and inattentive in school. He couldn't get his homework done outside of school. He was just a wreck. His executive functioning was really poor. He had poor decision-making skills because he was so impulsive and inattentive that he didn't realize that if I do A, B is going to happen, and then C is likely to happen. He didn't have that ability. So his frontal lobes were very underdeveloped because of poor executive functioning. On top of that, his amygdala, which is the emotional center of the brain, and research suggests that with reoffending criminals, the amygdala tends to be smaller in volume and in size. And his amygdala often kind of kicked in moments of survival, when he perceived a threat, when he perceived danger, when he was handcuffed, when he was put in this doctor's hands or this psychotherapist's hands. The amygdala would kickstart his fight or flight system. Cortisol, which is a stress hormone, with cortisol running through his body, with fear and adrenaline running, endorphins, and he started to feel kind of internally rewarded by bad behavior, by not listening, by not following the rules, by not respecting other people. That's when he became a victim of the criminal system, and he has remained that way. And I don't see him changing anytime soon, with the childhood trauma he was around, with the brain and neurological pieces of this puzzle, with the cortisol level and fight or flight mode kicking in, and having all of these risk factors, right? Putting him in the ACEs questionnaire, putting him on every question was yes on that questionnaire. It caused him to have an underdeveloped fear conditioning response. He didn't have the capability to be afraid or intimidated, and that didn't help because it made him unempathic. He didn't have the ability to have empathy, right? And so with all of these things happening, life got worse for him. And so let me point out for you some what we call sociobiological components. If you have a family member like this, a parent like this, and you can't understand why they can't get out of criminal behavior, here's a couple of ideas, and this is backed by research. Psychology suggests that there's often untreated ADHD. I want you to envision a spectrum, okay? From 1 to 10. 10 is the worst. Let's say that at level 1, okay, or 0, whichever you can envision, let's say you were diagnosed, or this individual was diagnosed with ADHD, okay? ADHD was not treated properly for this young man's case. His grandmother also didn't take the diagnosis very seriously. So at 0 or 1, we have ADHD. If that's not treated correctly, then we're going to have behavioral problems in school, inattention. We're going to have problems in mingling with other children. We're going to have some rebellion, right? And after those things continue to happen over a consistent period of time, then for level 5 of that spectrum, consider oppositional defiant disorder. Let's say, for example, that is the diagnosis, right? Because ADHD that's untreated can often turn into really bad behavioral problems in society. within school, within the community, within the home. So number 5 is oppositional defiant disorder. Okay, let's say that he continues to be rebellious, or this person continues to be rebellious, oppositional. They're not very conscious of how they're impacting other people. They kind of feel stimulated and energized by the crime that they are committing, by the things that they are doing to other people, right? And of course, with oppositional defiant disorder, quotation marks is crime, right? Because they're not really doing illegal things, but they are harming people and disregarding the rights of others, right? If that's not properly contained and treated, then we're probably going to end up with conduct disorder. And that's when there's fire setting. That's when there's animal cruelty. That's when burglaries happen, and robbery, and sometimes holding people hostage, right? Sexual assault can happen there too. Deviant sexual behavior can happen. Use of pornography, sex trafficking can even happen at that part of the illness, if you will, right? And so conduct disorder is really what that would be diagnosed as. Now, if that's not dealt with appropriately and treated, and it continues consistently for many years without treatment, then as 18 and up, you can then be diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, which can worsen into becoming a sociopath and a psychopath. That's how the individual lives on that spectrum until they become an adult. Sometimes it gets terribly worse when they hit the age of 18. Now, we also want to say lack of a conscience is also here. We also have gang violence. Stalking behaviors can develop at this time. Sometimes by the age of 14, psychotic disorders can also occur. Hearing and seeing things that's not really there. Having extrasensory experiences that don't make sense to others, that really kind of causes other people to say, you know what, are you on drugs? Do you need a doctor? What is this? Substance abuse often perpetuates already worsening behavior, and parental criminality or criminal behavior can also perpetuate the spectrum of behavior. That is why research suggests that economic instability, poor attachment, parental criminology, not having mental health challenges dealt with appropriately can all lead to worsened behavior. And it can really, in a sense, develop this criminal. And it can be very difficult for the system to just be like, here's a therapist, here's a probation officer, here's some medication, here's a job, and here's a place to live. Please continue to do well. Because when you have all these things fighting against the system, right, all the things that this person has been through and experienced and has become is really like this big barrier. You may also find yourself struggling with a life course of criminal or mental health issues yourself, right? Because this encompasses your entire life when you are being raised in a household like this. And if you have a close sibling or family member like this, it's going to be hard for you to escape, put up a boundary. And if you do make it over that barrier, which is a wonderful thing, then you're probably going to walk away with some damage and some capacity. And you're going to need the correct support and treatment. You also can struggle with abusers and users within your family. People who have this entire profile of a criminal don't really care. They don't always have effective empathy. And so they'll do whatever they need to do to you. If that's lie on you, turn you in, threaten your life, manipulate you and steal from you, really make you feel unloved, they will do it because this is how they are. When something is in their mind and something is in their heart to do, they're going to do it. And they don't care how you, the law or psychology, feels about it. Let me also mention that there's a higher mortality rate for you and for individuals in your family who have been raised in a dynamic like this, or if you've existed in a dynamic like this, there are higher mortality rates for many reasons, and sometimes even health challenges as well. This is tough, right, guys? Join me Saturday and Friday of this week as I'm going to be talking more about this. I hope to see you then. Bye-bye.